for me, it's for Paul. I'm doing a... Eric, here is the American public.
I'm John.
You're John.
It's only a joke.
Yes, well, John, here is the American public. 40 million American viewers.
It only looks like one man to me.
Staring you right in the face.
Oh, it's the cameraman.
He said you had unresolved leading tones, a false modal frame ending up as a plain diatonic. What would you say to that?
Well, we're going to see a doctor about that.
In a recent article, Time magazine put down pop music, and they referred to Day Tripper as being about a prostitute, and Norwegian Wood as being about a lesbian. Now, I just wanted to know what your intent was when you wrote it, and what your feeling is about the Time magazine criticism of the music that is being written today.
We were just trying to write songs about prostitutes and lesbians, that's all.
What kind of girls do you prefer?
My wife.
Your wife. What kind of girl is she?
She's a nice girl.
What kind of girl do you like?
John's wife.
John's wife?
Totally not.
What's your plan?
Nobody likes a smart aleck.
But the Beatle movement's going over there.
Yeah, it's you can even be a Beatle booster, folks.
Yeah. I must tell you, by the way, that Detroit University have got to stamp out the Beatle movement.
No.
Yeah, we heard about
You've heard about Detroit? They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
True, that.
True.
But did Mystery Tour put you off making a film completely yourselves?
Yeah, we're only ever going to be cartoons forever now, because they really put us off those. It's a new career piece. No good damn critics.
Well, when we said you'd just written it, have you in fact just done it? Did you do it a long time ago?
It's been a long time. Long time.
How long?
About 40 years or so, I think.
Come off it. How long ago did you write
It's a couple of years, some of it's old, some of it's new, something borrowed, something brown.
Okay, what's your favourite song?
White Christmas.
Yeah, and God Rule the Wencel's Kingdom. I like another one of my favourites.
Did you say White Christmas?
Yeah.
It's a good song.
Not in rock and roll.
Christmas.
Oh, yeah, it is, yeah. Yeah, it is. You've heard it.
God bless you, Mum. Thank you, Dad.
Yeah, it's rock and roll. I mean, it's not rock and roll, what is?
Welcome to a young author from Liverpool. In fact, you are the first author from Liverpool I've ever seen.
Great.
But your first book sold in 350,000 copies and came out this year. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. And tell me, you brought 3 of your friends. Could you please introduce
Yes,
them?
there's George Parasol, Ringo Stone, and Paul Machamley.
And did they have anything to do with your book? Did they help you or did they hinder you in any way?
No, they typed it out for me.
That's right. I mean, they can spell and you...
Oh, they spell very greatly.
That's nice. By the way, I read a review about it in Times Literary Supplement, and then I read the book. And then I wonder, are you influenced by Thurber or James Joyce?
None of them.
None of them?
Stewart. No.
James Stewart?
James Stewart and Betty Grable.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, I'm quite sure that our Swedish viewers would like to hear you read one of your poems.
Right.
Good.
Good dog, Nigel.
Yeah?
Half he goes, I met his sight, our little hairy friend. Half upon the lamppost bright.
So like that.
Half in round the bend.
Look. This one's better.
Is that better?
Look.
Ja, vad John Lennon säger och vad hans kompisar säger, det må de som kan Liverpoolska.
About a year and a half ago, there were quotes on the wire about your discussion of LSD and some other things, narcotics.
Yes, Larry.
It seemed to me from what I read that you had endorsed it and condemned it.
We were manufacturing it.
What's the story?
No, the business went bump.
Ringo, do you have any political affiliations at all?
No, he doesn't smoke.
I don't even smoke.
Do you think this is going to be a controversial tour like the Philippines was?
Oh, no. No, it's going to be fine.
What makes you say that, Paul?
Oh, it'll be fine. You watch. Yeah, it'll be great.
Paul, I don't know whether you know, but Mr. Edward Heath, the Lord Privy Seal, has said that he couldn't distinguish the other night what you were saying as Queen's English. Are you going to lose some of your Liverpool dialect for the Royal Show?
No, we don't all speak like the BBC.
We don't all speak like that, do we?
But come up north.
Well, with that, all I can do, lads, is to wish you lots and lots of luck at Royal
Thank
Show.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Jolly good.
Cheerio.
For the name Beatles, and what does it really mean?
John thought of the name Beatles, and he'll tell you about it now. It means Beatles, doesn't it? You know, that's just a name. You know, like shoe. Means shoe.
The shoes. You see, we could have been called the shoes for all you know.
John and Paul led a reporter into the house they were renting, sat down at the piano and answered questions about their relationship. In particular, how they approached songwriting.
We normally approach it on the M1.
And sort of come up, turn past London, and when we get to Scarborough, we feel we're there, as they say.
Well, I guess I asked for it.
No, we just got a very informal approach. We've got no formula at all, you know, for writing songs. We just do it as it happens. Sometimes John can write a line of a song. He can come up and say...
Things like that.
He could say that. He could just say that. He could just say that to me, and I could say, "No, John." And
often I disagree with Paul and say, "This has been done so many times, it's killed it."
But then sometimes, you know, we have a real row, and I say, "Listen here, John. I don't think that's right." But it depends, you know. Sometimes there's a line that he does, and then I do a line. Or sometimes John can write a whole song.
Ah.
Yes, oh, he's a wonder when he gets going. Sometimes I can even do that.
Is Ringo your real name, or is it a nickname?
It's a nickname.
What's your real name?
Richard.
Richard. How did the Ringo come about?
Because I wear 4 rings.
Wow.
Fair enough, yes. Let me ask you quickly, if you've
I'm not called Ringo.
No, I can see that. I hope the camera can.
It's called Hando.
Ringo going to continue acting? There's a possibility that he would be an actor if he dropped out of the Beatles.
The possibility wouldn't be as well.
John, I, being a little older than you for good-looking gentlemen, just a little older, as a matter of fact, I will remember the launching of Frank Sinatra and Johnny Ray and Elvis Presley. And yes, fantastic.
You know, sometimes I'd have it cut and sometimes let it grow like a lunatic. But, you know, I've had it off and on for 5 years.
Yeah. You should have seen it off. Pretty good.
They go for the Elvis Presley type of stuff, then, do they? I mean, do they go for the old rock and roll stuff?
I think so, yeah. A bit more. It depended, really, who was in. It depended upon who was in. I can't speak.
You think
speaking French so much, you see. What? Je me lève, etc.
Yeah. You brushed up your French, have you?
No, kidding. I can't speak a word of it.
You still can't speak a word?
No. John's very good.
Je me lève.
Bonsoir and all that sort of stuff. Always very good.
Just blowing up the balloon. There's lots of things, you know. We just got a friend of ours who's in electronics.
Oh, yeah.
I'll tell you about this chap, who's called Alex. And he's great. He's a Greek fella. And he's invented incredible things, you see. So that'll be big.
Well, are the days of the Beatles on stage over?
Well, they've been over for the last 2 years because we've been on land. But you never know, do you? With all these incredible electronics, we might come flying over New York playing one day.
Does the continuous living and working together impose any temperamental stress upon you?
No, actually, it's quite lucky because we've been together now for 40 years.
The songs like "And I Love Her," "If I Fell," "Michelle Yesterday," the more Winston type songs. Do you find yourselves able to write in this mood at a particular time of day or night? Are you nighttime writers or?
You'll have to excuse the dog, listeners, but he doesn't know we're on the radio.
How old is this dog?
7 weeks, actually. 7 weeks, so it doesn't really understand about the BBC yet.
What type of dog is it?
Old English sheepdog. It will be eventually.
A young English sheepdog.
At the moment, it's a spaniel.
One more question. Where do the hairdos come from? Where's the originality?
Scalp.
In those days,
Your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted, he's saying that he couldn't distinguish.
I can't understand
the Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
John, there's a rumour in the News of the Beatles paper that you might be leaving the group.
Rubbish. I'm
Absolutely.
contracted. Been trying to get out for years.
You've been writing some poetry.
What paper?
A paper called the News of the Beatles.
Never heard of it.
Do you want to see it?
No.
Must be American.
I've got it in my pocket. You want to see
It's
it?
American. They can stick
American?
it.
No, it's an English one.
Oh, okay.
You're writing some more
Can we
poetry.
have a look at it, please?
Sure.
Yes.
Hang on to that.
Okay. You're going to look at it now?
Yeah.
Well, good evening, viewers, and welcome to an interview with John McGregor.
That's not a
Thanks,
picture,
John.
is it?
It is. News of the Beatles.
Indeed, you buy cheap papers.
There you are.
You get
cheap
cheap
news.
stories.
Good morning. Buongiorno is back on a brisk Thursday morning, trying to get this interview up and going due to the fact that I have a faculty meeting at noon, and I need to get this out because I had promised that the content would keep coming up into the end, and I wanted to finish up on Chapter 8 on interviews. I also wanted to do something about content analysis. I felt that it was important to get to that content. So, I'm just, going to continue. I plan on putting out 2 more lectures, this one and one following it. Hopefully doing justice to content analysis due to the fact that, in order for you to really kind of get your tuition money's worth, to not do content analysis is a fundamental mass media research method, and it's even like Dr. Bates, remember in the conversation we had with Berger, she was talking about how content analysis is still going on with the media, and she gave an example of this study of like what Trump says, so we're going to do content analysis and we're going to finish up with interviews, and hopefully you guys availed yourself of the first lecture on interviews, and then also the raw footage I put up there with for an interview that I did with a guy by the name of Mike Shade from Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, and how I kind of did a play-by-play. I spent a lot of time like looking back at that interview and seeing what went wrong and what went right, and kind of using it. And I think that's I think that it's like example is the best form of instruction, really. And I chose to use that interview due to the fact that it wasn't perfect. It wasn't like one of the best interviews I didn't do. It wasn't like Frost Nixon. It wasn't like having said that, back in the day when I was working at Broadcast News, it's like I actually interviewed some a handful of like fairly famous people, and even for my documentary. And some of those were real, and even a lot of the guest speakers that I've had in my classes, we've had some famous people between image theory and intro to mass media, famous and near famous people, and interacting with them. And essentially what I try to do is do interviews. Am I the best interviewer there ever was? Am I like Bill Moyers? No. But I do kind of know my sense around things, especially when it comes to like unstructured interviews, which is, one of the ones that Berger, kind of concentrates on, the unstructured interview. But I want to talk about other forms of interviews too. Interviews wherein certain results are, you're looking to get information. Remember the prisoner, information. And we're going to do that, and then we're going to get into content analysis, you know. And then I had and I want to do a reveal on that, just in case you didn't get it. The interview that I took from the book, it comes from a book called Toxic Town, IBM Pollution and Industrial Risk, by an anthropology PhD, actually, by the name of Peter Little, who I got to know on another project. And for those of you who were guessing and poking, it's like the interview I posted was done with me, under a pseudonym of Eric. And somebody had asked me about it on the blog, you know, why did they use a pseudonym? Because a lot of times, you know, and straight like research projects, you know, that there are multiple empirical and research and ethical reasons why one may or may not reveal the identity of their subjects. You know, a lot of times, especially with like, you know, scientific and experimental research and stuff like that, you know, it's you know, there's some legalese to a lot of it, you know, especially for researchers, you know, of like keeping certain confidentiality, you know. It's which is different from, say, documentaries, and I had like pointed that out in one of my replies to one of your comments, that a lot of times when you're doing documentaries, you know, in order to make an argument, sometimes it is like essential that people reveal their identities, you know, whenever, you know, but every context is different. You know, if you need to make an argument, you know, I'm sure you've seen numerous examples of interviews within documentaries that are conducted with people whose identities have either been digitally mosaicked out or their voices have been run through some type of phase enhancer in order to protect their identity. You know, and we're going to talk about a famous case of investigative journalism interviewing that toppled the presidency, and an informant that was kept secret for decades by the Washington Post, a guy that went under the name of Deep Throat. We're going to talk about that, you know. So yeah, you know, to answer your question, it's like it was me. And also, you know, I was a little bit dismayed. We're going to talk about doing transcriptions today. We're going to talk about transcribing interviews, too. And the different ways that people transcribe stuff. And the researcher in question that had interviewed me, Dr. Peter Little, did transcriptions of and he did a lot of interviews, and he transcribed every single one of them, and he used a machine to do transcriptions. And we're going to talk about different software that you would use, why you would want to transcribe your interviews, and also we're also going to talk about Bongiorno's dirty secret. Bongiorno's dirty secret of hating to do transcriptions. I hate it, and it's like more often than not when I have interviews, it's like I don't do the transcriptions. And I'll tell you why I don't do the transcriptions, you know, later on. It's like, A, I'm lazy, and B, we'll talk about it. I look at interviews when I'm working on a documentary project like the one I'm working on. I look at interviews time and time again to the point where I've got such a good memory. I remember what people said. It's not really, transcriptions are not really something that works particularly well for me, you know. But, you know, different projects call for different things, especially when it comes to quantitative projects where you're going to need to maybe transcribe so that you can collate your data. You know, it's like a documentary, that's different. You know, it's like you're trying to build an argument a lot of times. And a lot of times it's about aesthetics, you know, and it's about, you know, building a narrative as opposed to, you know, doing quantitative research where you might have to transcribe and code and do all that stuff. But I want to get back to the nuts and bolts of doing interviews. Things you should be looking out for. And so I hope you guys are just doing the work. I hope you looked at that interview I did with Mike Shade in its entirety. It was a little bit dry, but I hope you read, because I threw a lot of work at that. And it's I want you guys to when I throw a lot of work at something, it's I want people to read it. It's it's not like keeping a diary. I want to keep it to myself. We ended out with talking about avoiding leading questions. We talked about the ways in which questions are framed. In order for you to procure, the most factual, unbiased information you can. Because after everything is said and done with investigations, it's what are we looking for? Yes, we're looking for information. We are looking for information. But we are also looking for the truth. And the truth is a slippery beast. We get into these metaphysical ideas of what constitutes the truth. Because we all know that sometimes, and even Berger will say, whether it be in a courtroom or whether it be, in an interrogation room or whatever it is, that it's sometimes your informant will say more by what they don't say, or what they leave out, and therein lies the idea that sometimes it's when somebody tells a lie, the fact that they told a lie can be constituted as a truth of sorts. The truth of the lie. For instance, it's the historical truths of, certain politicians, for instance, like in the Watergate burglaries, that, it was the fact that they lied was historical data. Hence it was a form of the truth. They lied. A lot of people lie under oath, in impeachment proceedings or in jury things, and that becomes the truth, that they lied, So avoid leading questions. You want to try to, and there's a whole methodology to that, especially when you're doing surveys. You want your questionnaires to, depending on what information, and we're going to talk about this in content analysis, depending on what you're looking for, what you're attempting to define, or what data you're trying to collect, and the ways in which you're going to use it, right? Have your informants, the other one he comes up with here is have your informants define their terms sometimes. Sometimes you need to, he says, if your informants use terms you are unfamiliar with or that you think need some attention, ask them to define what they mean by the terms. Because we all know, once again, we get back into everything from discourse analysis to rhetorical analysis. What somebody's conception of a certain word might mean, especially slippery stuff, like good and bad. The big ones, the big ticket items, justice, fairness, all this stuff. Or maybe it has to do with just, and I'm a fairly literate human being, but every once in a while it's I'll be listening to NPR, or I'll be watching something, or I'll be reading something, an interview with something, and they'll bring out a term that I need to Google in order for me to garner, that's just doing due diligence in terms of trying to understand something, whatever you're reading. But sometimes somebody, and I'll have to, and I'm sure that I have found myself in circumstances where I'm where I've had to ask an interviewee, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Could you be a little more specific? Or that I need to, kind of manage the discourse to get to a place where it's more in keeping with what I'm attempting to get at. So there's that whole idea of, don't be afraid of being it's like the old adage, it's no question, there's no stupid questions, especially when, you're putting yourself on the line and you need to stand behind your material. You want to, let people know that you did your homework. And we had talked about this. Stay focused. You need to stay focused in an interview situation, you know. And that is, you got to be wearing a couple different hats in an interview, especially when you're using like anything from like transcription devices to a camera, and you might have to be doing double duty, you know, a lot of times. And that's why I've gotten really good. People make fun of me when, like, in the middle of a lecture, I got to like interrupt myself and go to the bathroom, and then I come back and I walk through the door and I pick right up from where I was. You know, that's just something that you develop as a skill of staying on point. In fact, there's even and Mike Shade was good at that too. Shade was good at that because at one point, if you notice in the interview that I did with Mike Shade, that all of a sudden there's all these sirens and all this crap. And we got to stop, and I was like, just hold that thought, you know. And then I was kind of like, you know, I know you're good at that. It's like, you know, and then we just let things pass, and then we picked like right back up, you know, you know, staying on focus. Once your informants have started talking, make sure your questions don't get off track. All right, make sure your questions. It's one thing, you know, when there's an interruption or something like that. You know, and I even say in my my analysis of the Shade interview, there's a couple times where we have to stop. We make a little bit of small talk, but I keep the small talk even kind of relevant. You know, you know, because it's like, you know, you're in a situation. A lot of times it's like, for instance, you're going to get an interviewee, and you've got to make hay while the sun is shining. You know, you've got to make hay while the sun is shining, and don't risk any of that time being wasted. You know, and it's a dance. It's really a dance. You know, stay on focus. Don't get off track. Focus on getting more details about what your informants are saying. Sometimes the devil is in the details. We know that. And sometimes it's like, you know, people want to go off. You know, you're going to find that, you know, it's like, it's a wide, wide world out there of different opinions and different, you know, of different isms. And, you know, you're often going to have interviewees that like to take you off track, you know, about certain things. And sometimes it's like, it can be interesting, but it depends on how much time you have, you know. It's like, you got to kind of be, you know, it's like it's a question of balance, you know. It's like you can't be cutting people. It's like cutting people. First of all, it's like, you know, you don't want to cut off your subject in the middle. You don't want to get into the habit of cutting your subject off when he or she is saying stuff. All right. Unless, once again, it becomes a judgment call of, you know, if this person has gone down the rabbit hole, you know, and wants to tell you about, you know, something totally unrelated because that's their thing, you need to kind of learn how to reel that back in. You need to learn how to kind of reel it back in very deftly to get back on track without, you know, once again, it's kind of like, it's diplomacy. You know, you don't want to offend people. You know, and what he says about being affable, for, you know, 9 times out of 10, you know, you want to leave a situation where you're on good footing and you've been affable with the person, and you know, and while playing under the rules of fair play. That's not always the case. You know, there was like, I'll give you like an anecdote here of a situation where I was doing the IBM documentary, and I wanted to talk to a worker, and he was willing, and he was very, very elderly, and he was a little bit reticent, but I had called him ahead of time. I had gotten his information. Somebody had suggested I had talked to him, and so he was like cool about it, but you could tell he was older and his memory was slipping. And I went in, and his son shows up, and his son, who was also like had worked for IBM, like watched us like a hawk and was very, very, and I started to get the feel, and I tried to be as affable as I could about it, but I started to get the sense that the son really didn't want me there. He didn't want his father talking, and it wasn't a really good interview. It wasn't like, and I can just remember, that was years ago, but I can just remember like feeling this vibe out and just realizing, buongiorno, you're not getting any really relevant information from this guy. It's like it's creating an uncomfortable situation. Just wrap it. Pay your Fonda dues, and let's like just call it a day. Sometimes you get in those situations, whether you become an investigative journalist, it's like I'll tell you, it's like, I was in situations working for the news where, I'd get, yelled at and pushed and all kinds of stuff, Not as much in the documentary stuff, but, you need to know when to, like, call it a day and whatever. It's a question of, once again, it's a dance. It's a dance, But more often than not, people, it's like if a person has agreed to do an interview with you and you have done your homework and you have done enough due diligence to be as transparent as you can with that person, more often than not, if there's homework, it's like, and I need to talk about it because Berger really doesn't spend a lot of the chapter talking about needing to do your homework with an interviewee and making sure that you've set up conditions ahead of time where where once you get there, they have a sense of like what you're looking for, how they're going to be represented, and then it's like an interview can rise and fall on how much homework you have done and how much of a relationship you have built prior to the interview itself with this person, and that you've stood your ethical ground and you've told them what, so that, they're not feeling like they've been had, that's very important. So staying focused in conversations, there's often a tendency to wander, next one, make sure your questions are clear. Make sure your questions are clear. And once again, there's an example in the Mike Shade interview in which I ask him a question, probably about 12, 13 minutes in, and it's kind of wordy, and I'm trying to get to something here, and he asks me to rephrase it. He asks me to rephrase the question. So I rephrase the question. Then he gets it, what Berger keeps on referring in the chapter to a long quote at the beginning by Bakhtin, the literary critic and cultural critic, about how this Q&A thing leads itself is a kind of evolving beast, and that questions sometimes need to be organic. That questions, you come in with a list of questions sometimes. Depending on what the nature of the research is, you might need to change your game up a little bit. If you're going to, and you need to be able to improvise, and you need to be able to be articulate about what you're talking about. And so there's that. Make sure your questions are clear. If you ask unclear questions, you'll get ambiguous and relatively useless answers, right? You want to cut the fat. You want to stay lean and mean. You want to cut the fat. Your respondents may be trying to answer your questions as accurately as possible, but if they don't understand your questions, or your questions are fuzzy, informants won't be able to supply the information you're seeking. It becomes a question of, it's like, if I'm fishing for smallmouth bass, I use a certain kind of repel lure. If I'm fishing for, trout, I use another kind of lure. All right? Depending on what I'm fishing for. That's a picture of Earl Morris, the famous documentary filmmaker, down on the bottom with interviewing Donald Rumsfeld. That's a great interview, too. That's a great documentary where he interviews George Bush's Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, after the fact. He's actually looking at... It looks to me like he's looking at footage he had shot prior with a green screen behind it, but that's Morris. I thought that... once again, Berger says here, it's a dance. Ask for amplifications. He calls it amplifications and examples, right? What's an amplification? An amplification is sometimes what I get into the really bad habit of doing when I'm lecturing. Sometimes I'll repeat something verbatim that I just said in order to give it more gravitas, more weight. Repetition. As a strategy, repetition. We've talked about this. We talk about it, in the other class it's like in its propagandistic aspects, but getting people to get solid on something. All right, it's like, is this like, okay, you say this, but would you go as far as saying this? Because you need to get. Sometimes somebody might be ambivalent about the information that they're giving. And you need them to kind of step up to it. You need them to kind of step up to what they're saying and make it a little more, because, if you're thinking ahead of time, especially in documentary, you're always thinking. You're always thinking about where something could be used as you're doing it. It's like, it's just part of the game. It's part of the game, You need to be, and sometimes, we'll talk about like how sometimes it's better just to kind of throw shit at the wall and see what sticks, but also there's the strategy of, kind of calling as you're doing it, like there's that going on. Amplification and examples. When talking with your informants, keep in mind some ways of getting more details about the subject. Could you be more specific, right? Here are some useful responses to a statement by an informant about something that happened. And this is all just kind of cookie cutter crap, And then what happened, Kind of moving the narrative along. Sometimes someone's telling you a story. Who was involved? You need to know the people. Sometimes it's like somebody... I'll be interviewing somebody and somebody will refer to somebody else and I've got to write that name down. I'm going to can you spell that for me? So that I can later on, if I got to do a Google search on this person, I'm not trying to figure it out phonetically. When did it happen? Sometimes timelines are very, very important in building something. You have to understand your timeline. Especially and this for you law people and for you people that want to be lawyers or paralegals or whatever you want to do, all of this stuff that we're talking about today is absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential. Why did it happen? Why did it happen? Once again, we're back down to these kind of journal, and we'll talk about, the who, what, when, why, and how of something that journalists and Journalism 101, and young kids, getting their first interview job or something, they carry around their little playbook, in order to do stuff. Where did it happen? What was the result? Everything's about the law of cause and effect. Just different different modalities to kind of move stuff along that you get better with. Over time. How do you feel about it? How do you feel about it? And its variations about getting emotion out of people is very, very important for journalists and documentary filmmakers, because more often than not, you're building you're building a work that's based on a kind of emotional subjects, and doing the IBM documentary, I spoke to a lot of people that had been hurt, and a lot of people that were angry, and a lot of people that would often tear up a little bit, about what was going on. And you need to be, once again, taciturn and respectful, about what is going on in a situation. All right, I'm not going to say that. I was going to say something that I'm not going to say. You can also ask informants for examples. Give me some examples of what you're talking about. It's like, once again, mining data. And anything to get more information and detail. As long as it is related to the subject being investigated, it does not lead you off on a tangent. Then he talks about kinds of questions here. Different kinds of questions, that should just kind of go without saying, but this taxonomy of questions, there are different kinds or categories of questions we might ask informants. Donald Treadwell lists some of the more important kinds in his book, Introducing Communication Research, Paths of Inquiry. These questions are adapted from the work of an anthropologist, James Spradley. All right, so there's this anthropological perspective from it, that we've already seen, and everything from rhetoric to semiotics to discourse analysis. Descriptive questions. You ask informants to describe phenomena. Take me on a mini tour. Questions are one type of mini tour questions are one type of descriptive question. For example, how do you use your social networking sites in a typical day? It's like Berger's kind of hung up on, kind of making the stuff relevant. But once again, back to the Mike Shade interview that I did. First question I asked him, just to kind of open it up. Mike, what's a usual day for you like? What's a usual day for you like? How do you dirty your hands? And he's like, what do you mean? And then I get more specific, and then boom, he's off. This is what I do. So that's an important kind of question. Getting a kind of, eagle's eye view of like what this person is about. Structural questions explore the relationships among the terms informants use. For example, would you describe text messaging as part of as part of your social networking? In this example, you're creating this kind of conceptual framework of ideas and how they are connected to each other, and how they're connected to each other in a person's mind. Contrast questions help researchers find similarities, differences, and relative importance of informants' concepts. Another type of contrast question is a rating or ranking question. For example, you talk about watching online movies with your friends, and relaxing with online movies. Which of the two of these three are most similar? And this is kind of one of these, kind of vanilla, kind of survey questions that are absolutely essential for things like the survey, depending on what you want to elicit, but you're attempting to kind of plumb you're ultimately, dare I say it, you're like mining for data. You're mining for data when you're doing research interviews, and, these nuanced questions may be, they may seem immaterial, that those different shades of gray might seem immaterial to you, but for that specific study, it might have been important. Then we get to investigative reporting, doing investigations, which is, once again, a different animal. Once again, a different animal. This is a picture from the film. This is actually not the real people. This is a picture from the film All the President's Men, starring Dustin Hoffman. It starred Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. Very good film, by the way. Definitely something, I think it was Alan Pakula, famous director, did a film called 3 Days of the Condor with Redford again that I just actually downloaded because I want to watch. I haven't seen it in a long time. But Pakula does a film on the Watergate break-ins. Remember what Watergate is. And if you don't know what Watergate is, shame on you. Run straight to your Google or straight to whatever and find out what Watergate was. Because Watergate was Watergate was a conspiracy inside the White House with the acting president at the time, Richard M. Nixon, in which there were break-ins done at the Democratic National Headquarters in order to get information. It was the most important thing going on that year. In fact, I would dare say that the Watergate hearings during that summer had as much media attention as the pandemic. I would go as far as saying that. It's like, I can remember, being, I was too young to remember. But I can remember as much, I was 11 years old. I remember that whole summer of, I think it was 75, all of the daytime shows were canceled on all the networks due to the Watergate hearings. And they went on for weeks. And they kept on bringing in different people, And ultimately, Woodward and Bernstein, who were the two reporters that Hoffman and Redford are portraying here, Woodward and Bernstein, very, very important, would get a few tips on what was going on, and they would follow up on a story. And the film is very good. I think Jason Robards plays the editor of the Post at that time. And they realize, and it's very, very dramatic, and they realize that, one, they've got to be very, very careful with all of their fact-checking. It's like, believe it or not, my friends. It's like journalism back then. It's hard, under the current circumstances of the carnival of fucking lies that passes as mass media journalism, it's hard to believe that in the bygone days in the shadowy mist of time, there was this credo of journalistic ethics that involved checking your facts. All right, checking your facts. Because you knew that people were going to come back, could possibly come back on you. And the stakes in the Watergate investigation were a presidency, folks. Because what Woodward and Bernstein did, and the stories that the Washington Post printed, caused the fall of the president. Nixon, they impeached him. He resigned, to avoid impeachment. And that was the power of journalism, and it involved the drama of if we're gonna do this thing, if we're gonna run this, we better make sure. And it was very, very problematic due to the fact that a lot of their informants, and we'll talk about this, one of their primary informants was a White House insider that kept his identity secret. They would get him via phone. They met him a couple times, but in journalism, you're going to find out that sometimes you reserve the right. It's almost like the right of patient doctor confidentiality, or a lot of different other institutional forms of confidentiality. All right. Sometimes it's you might have to protect your informants. Due to the fact that it's an ugly and violent world out there, and that sometimes it's I even ran into it in the IBM doc. People that were afraid of, saying too much. IBM was a big corporation, and I knew, and there were times where under certain circumstances, I would talk to other filmmakers and other people who had gone after IBM, like Edwin Black, the journalist and author Edwin Black, who became a friend, who did an interview with me on it for the documentary, who had written and done this incendiary book called IBM and the Holocaust that connected IBM and Thomas Watson Sr. and the lead management of IBM during World War II to actually doing business and leasing computational and tabulating equipment like punch card readers and all kinds of stuff to the Nazis, to the Third Reich. And he had all this information that basically, indicted them, and at that point, it's like, I remember in my interview with Black, it's like, I had to find out, like, you like, it's like, did they ever come back at you? And you put yourself in the position sometimes, whether you're a whistleblower or whether you're doing a documentary on something controversial, you may find yourself asking yourself questions like, will they come back at me? And how can they come back at me? Or will I be sued? And these are all things that you need to parse. I remember a famous documentary filmmaker by the name of Charles Ferguson that an ex-girlfriend of mine was actually friends with. She was friends with Ferguson. And he does this right around the 2008 bailout. He'll do a documentary called Inside Job, that will basically go after the whole financial collapse of the subprime mortgage crisis and the subsequent bailout. And he'll find so many smoking guns in that thing that when he accepted the Academy Award, my friends, in his acceptance speech, he said that he had put his children into hiding because he was afraid of their safety. He was afraid for their safety, and that is poignant and that is chilling, and that is, but once again, I don't want to get all like weepy about it, but when you're committed to things like social justice and economic justice and political justice, you're not going to make friends with everybody. However, it's like, can you be proud of yourself? Can you sleep at night without, having to drink yourself to death? I would say yes. There's nothing wrong with standing for the truth. There's nothing wrong with like going and like exposing things that are just plain evil, And sometimes it's like a human necessity for us to like stand up to stuff, speaking truth to power, like they say, and being able to and being able to do that, is sometimes the times call for it, and if not you, who, and if not now, when, and certainly under our current circumstances, it's like standing up and being and standing by your stuff, and holding on to your integrity. That's some big stuff. So they had an informant called Deep Throat that would later on, like, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, he finally came forward. Most of all the like people that could have gotten at him from that whole like den of like lizards, like Howard Hunt and John Dean and all these other guys that had been, and G. Gordon Liddy. These names might mean nothing to you, but there was this like circle of henchmen around Liddy, around Nixon, and he was afraid. Just like some of the informants in the Trump, there have been, instances of like whistleblowers in like the Trump administration that have tried to keep themselves their identity's secret, and Trump has gone after them, So it can be a dangerous game. It can be a really dangerous game, Truth is dangerous. Truth is more dangerous than anything, really, when you think about it. Questions investigative reporters ask, often different, often a little bit more about getting information from people that might not necessarily be, just gushing to kind of, indict themselves. It's like questions that investigative reporters have to ask. This is due to this setup that I have that is kind of ridiculous. What do we got? We can learn something from the questions investigative reporters, generally experts in conducting research, ask. All right, we can learn a lot. Let's consider a situation. He uses a situation that I need to clarify here. Some of the terms that he uses you might not. Let's consider a situation in which an investigative reporter is asked to do a story about a trial in which the defendant is accused of running a Ponzi scheme and defrauding stockholders. All right. Here are some questions the reporter might want to ask. What's a Ponzi scheme? In short, I always used to have a joke about this. I used to think that people were saying a Fonzie scheme. Fonzie was this character from the show Happy Days. So I figured, I was like, why are people talking about what would a Fonzie scheme be? Would it be about trying to date triplets? And if you know the show, you'd get the joke. But it's actually a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi was a guy that this whole idea was named after from the 20s, who was basically bilking people for money. He was setting up these scams, and Ponzi schemes usually they're almost kind of like the evil side of multi-level marketing, where you're getting investor. In short, simplified, because we don't got a lot of time, you're taking investors' money and you're using it to pay. It's like, and then you're getting new investors, and you're taking the money of the new investors to pay dividends. Supposed, because you're lying, you're paying dividends to the people that first got. There's no money really being generated except the money of the people that you're roping in, that you're using their money to pay the former people that signed up, acting as if it's their share or their dividend, whatever. And Charles Ponzi was a guy that had done this, and this was during the 20s, and he had depending on how big the Ponzi scheme is, you can start talking hundreds of millions of dollars, and people, especially during this whole turn of the tide of corruption on Wall Street in the 21st century, a lot of people tried to institute Ponzi schemes, a lot of stock portfolios, a lot of financial under the term financial consultant. And stock portfolio manager, and just this whole cabal of satanic warlocks that work in basically what is a black art. All right, the black art of what they call wealth management. That's a euphemism for the black arts. All right, so just keep that in mind. All right, so some of the questions you want to ask. Who was involved in the case? Who was it? You need to know. Kind of like any kind of crime trial, whatever. Whether it be Russiagate, God forgive me for saying it, or whatever. Joe Biden stuff. With his son, whatever it is. It's as an investigative journalism, you got to know the names. Who was involved in this thing? And sometimes you've got to dig. What? Okay, what? What's a Ponzi scheme? You got to know what it is, right? What are the facts about the case, right? What are law enforcement officials doing, right? Are they doing anything? Are they doing nothing? Because for instance, in any kind of scandal, there's always this question of whether You know, it's like, you know, especially with things like they have to do with like high power politics, you know, and the rulership of certain places. You know, there's all these games that get played, you know, that, you know, really good journalists have to like kind of dig through, you know, to make their case. So, you know, it's like, what if you're in a situation where the law enforcement agents are like, you know, not doing anything? Maybe they're protecting the person because he's a powerful person. You know, maybe the investigation is kind of half-hearted or anemic or trying to like, you know, all this kind of stuff that we see in modern, you know, crime dramas, you know, and stories about corruption. What does the suspect's lawyers have to say? What do the suspect's lawyers have to say? You know, because that's important, you know. And once again, it's like what you're going to get in a situation ain't always the truth, you know. When did who, what, when, where, why, and how? When did the accused start running the Ponzi scheme? When was it discovered? You know, this applies to anything. You know, for instance, it's like in my documentary on IBM, had to do research. When did they first start doing this? You know, when is their actual, it's like finding EPA documents and finding, and finding New York State Department of Environmental Conservation documents, or else going to other people with the documents to find out, when did this thing start? How much is there? And in my documentary, you'll see between 1977 and 1978 alone, how much was down. You know, how did the Ponzi scheme go on for as long as it did? How did the IBM spills and dumpings go on for as long as they did? You'll find that out in my documentary. You know why, right? These types of questions are at the heart of all inquiries researchers make. They require investigators to offer descriptions, explanations, narratives, and interpretations. That goes without saying. He'll go on to quote from, he'll say that, and this starts to get into coding and transcribing stuff. You know, sometimes it's like you might be in a situation where you need to collate your data and use symbols, you know, as you're reading, as you're going back and looking at your narrative. And he says, and he brings up this one from Laboff and Waletsky, narrative analysis, right? Ways of code of producing codes to give your narrative a shorthand of a type, right? You know, an abstract, a summary of an abstract, a summary of the narrative's contents. Orientation, time, place, situation involved. This might be when you're like doing transcriptions, you might be coding your stuff, CA, complicating action, sequence of events. You know, these are the kind of things, and I understand why Arthur is kind of like hot on this topic, because he does a lot of like narrative writing, and so he wants to understand things in terms of narrative, you know, resolution, how things turned out, coda, returns the discussion to the present. You know, what Laboff and Waletsky will assert is that every narrative, you know, once again, you know, and in the intelligentsia, when you're doing research, you're always attempting to find the rules. You're always attempting to find, you know, there is a whole branch of knowledge seeking that is really intent on being able to codify certain things as being like, to apply to every single circumstance, you know. And there's this drive to want to codify things, you know, and he'll even get into it with his discussion on humor. Arthur will even get to it in this chapter on his discussion on humor. So we've got that. Interview transcripts. All right. Doing transcripts. What's a transcript? A transcript is simply this. You know, a transcript is a written printout of your interview. A written printout of your interview, and for a long period of time, documentary journalists and documentary filmmakers were using. In fact, the interview that was done. I wanted to talk about this too. Pete Little, who wrote this book, did interviews with a lot of different people, and he used a transcript device. This was around 2009 to 2010. Now there's software out there to do transcriptions, all right? I don't know that much about them. I know that they're getting better, I guess. But he had what was called, he would do audio recordings. He did an audio recording with me. And he would literally, it's like, and it's very true. It's like, Berger talks about the fact that usually for 1 hour, it's a bitch to do, 1 hour of, 1 hour of interviews can be, translated into 7 or 8 man hours of doing this. So that they used to have, and they still do. I think I found this on eBay. These foot pedal devices where you can take your tape. It seems primitive now, but they're actually very useful. You take your tape, your audio tape, and you have a and you're sitting there and you're transcribing, and the foot pedal is basically forward reverse, so that you can go back really quick. In the age of digital media and video, it's a little bit archaic, but, Pete Little was still using it, But the problem lies in the fact that sometimes it's not, when you're doing audio discussions with people and then you do transcriptions, I find that in the interview that is done in here with me, I have to, point out the fact that when I read it, I recognized the fact that sometimes his transcription he'd get a word off or two. He would get a word off or two in his transcriptions in certain places. I don't want to come up with examples right now, but he would misinterpret an audio thing in his transcription, and sometimes it would change the whole meaning of something that I said. I'm just saying. All right, it's somewhat flawed, I have to say, not to call Pete out on it. It's an excellent book. You can get it right at the SUNY Broome Library, by the way. It came out from NYU, New York University Press, which is, reputable. So, doing transcripts, all right? Because a lot of times it's when I did my focus group study for Margaret Bates's class, I ended up having to do a transcript of the focus group, and it was root canal surgery. It's you sit there and you do transcripts sometimes because you need to have a written record because you're collating data sometimes, and it's best to have it. Sometimes it's best to have it in your hand like that, and sometimes it's sometimes it's when I'm doing documentaries and I'm doing hour-long interviews with people, it's doing transcriptions, it's I would rather, and this is just me, and this is just, don't do what I do every single time. Don't do what I do all the time. I would just get to a point where I would just watch an interview and get acquainted enough with that interview that I knew what was going on in it. And I knew, and I would do, what I would do, and this is and it's not a cop-out, I would go back through and just do counter numbers. Just instead of writing down every single word the person said, doing at 29, for instance, doing a counter log, you would do in Premiere, as an editor. Some of you who want to be editors, you're going to do a counter log, with your time code, and figure out. It's kind of like that picture we saw with Earl Morris and Rumsfeld. There was time code, and it's you'll be at 1450, so and so starts talking about this, or literally quote him, You know, and that's kind of like a shorthand, you know. But sometimes, depending on what field you get into, you know, they're going to want you to do transcripts, you know. Especially, you know, if you get to like the doctoral level and you're doing a dissertation, your dissertation committee might be like, we want, you know, you need to do. But it's gotten easier, I guess. It's gotten easier due to the fact that now there's software where you can actually just load your information, you know, in, and then it processes it out, and it translates it, and it spits it back out as a thing. Spits it back out as a thing. So then Berger talks about coding transcripts, right? Because then you have a transcript, and he says you've got to be able to code it. And he says there's no like hard and fast rules about, you know, coding, you know, but a great deal depends on the nature of the material being coded, right? What do you talk? What's the subject, you know? And then you'll come up with a shorthand for certain things, you know. You know, for instance, like you're doing. Sorry about that. Battery ran out on me. Got to pick right back up from where I left off. So, you know, depending on the material you're working on, you're going to want to code it in a certain way. You're going to have certain codes. You got to read over your material as a whole to get an overview of it, you know. What's the theme, you know? This, like, you know, once again, it takes a little bit of, like, you know, brain power to figure out, like, you know, pick one transcript and examine it carefully, looking for topics covered, you know. It's like, you know, maybe one of your transcripts will act as the model for the rest of them. Do this for several transcripts and make a list of all the topics that were covered, you know. And that depends on, like, the research, you know. It's like, for instance, you know, say you're doing research on, you know, say you're doing research with, like, coders, you know, like, give an ironic example, people that do coding for a living. You know, it's like you might do interviews, like somebody did a book about code, and the class did a book on coders, right? And I'm sure that author interviewed people and then, you know, had to come up with shorthand for what they were talking about. You know, at certain times they might have been talking in some technical jargon where, you know, for instance, it's like no matter what, you know, it's like, for instance, I'm sure that when Mike Shade is dealing with people, you know, in corporate manufacturing or other places, that there's code words that you use, you know, for different topics that are being covered, you know. You make abbreviations for each topic, and you go through the transcripts, and you make abbreviations for the topics, so that then, you know, once you go back to the transcripts, you know, it's like, say you're looking for some specific, you know, topic, something that you're looking for, you know. It's like, say, for instance, you're doing a study on, say, for instance, you know, you're interviewing people about television violence or whatever. You know, you might be making this distinction between, these distinctions between things like, for instance, like gun violence, you know, or graphic violence, or slapstick violence, like comic, like, you know, violence in cartoons. And you might have different codes for each of those kinds of violence. That's an example, you know, or whatever you're doing. Different variations, you know, you have to be smart and come up with a taxonomy, you know, a code for what you're looking for. So you make abbreviations, you go through the transcripts, you put down appropriate abbreviations, blah, blah, blah. If your topic's listed, doesn't cover all the material, see if you can think of new topics. Turn your topics into categories. I just gave an example of that. Make sure that the categories cover all your transcripts. Don't duplicate one another. Decide on a final set of abbreviations that you're going to use. You know, it's like, okay, I get it, Arthur, but, you know, something might come up where you need to create another abbreviation for some phenomena that you start finding that you didn't necessarily think was going to pop up. Assemble all the material, see whether you can refine your coding and get fewer and more descriptive categories. You know, once again, streamline. You know, streamline. You know, it's like, you know, for instance, in documentary filmmaking, I talk to documentary filmmakers. There's this thing in documentary filmmaking that when you're working on a film, first, people have a tendency to say that first it gets bigger, then it's supposed to get smaller, right? Like the idea that you've got all this material and then you've got to start kind of condensing it. And then I get these like advisors and people like that want me to like, just cut shit out of it that I don't want to cut, and then you get into this like thing with them, But Creswell drew, so these are from Creswell drew on the ideas of Bogdan and Bicklin, who suggested using abstract coding categories as topics. They proposed that researchers look for the following kinds of codes: setting and context codes. Setting, what's the setting? What's the context? Perspectives held by subjects. What are the perspectives? Is the person liberal? Is the person conservative? Is the person an environmentalist? Is the person anti-environmental? Perspectives held by, are they religious? Are they amoral? Are they like ends justifies the means kind of people? Subjects, ways of thinking about people and objects. Sometimes you might be talking to people that, for instance, in the Chris Hedges book, I'm sure he taught, it's like when he was like interviewing these people from the bondage community, or race, or these hate groups, it's like, subjects' ways of thinking about people and objects, that might come into play. Process codes, what was the process? Process codes, whether maybe you're doing something about social media, or just internet use in general, and you might have codes for things like gaming. Maybe you're doing something on gaming where you need to do a code just for like MMORPGs or like playing alone or first-person shooter games or whatever, and you might have to come up with a taxonomy to like cover the things that the kind of games that people are playing. And I don't know a lot about gaming, but it could get very baroque too, very intricate. Activity codes, strategy codes. This gets into rhetorical analysis a little bit. When somebody is, it's like, I'm sure if I was like pushed to it, if somebody put a gun to my head, I could come up with like an analysis of the strategy codes that Mike Shade and myself use in that interview. Do I want to do it? No. Activity codes, relationship and social structure codes, It's like, once again, it's like, I'm talking to, for instance, I can think of an example where I'll talk to somebody, I remember talking to a woman whose daughter grew up on Farm to Market Road up in Enwell and used to play out in this creek where they dumped all the shit, and she got leukemia, and in the film I have to like distinct. It's like I do the mother, and then I do the daughter, and I interview them. Okay, I interview, to be able to like build this relationship, because it's like for my audience to understand about her daughter getting sick, I got to bring the daughter in right afterwards, and I got to CG them. CG them meaning bump, 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 bump. Daughter of bump, 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 right? Relationship and social structure codes, Pre-assigned coding schemes. All right, we've done that to death. Berger, who has done books on humor, as you know, he's done all kinds of cultural analysis. He makes a case for like the codes that he comes up with that he does in his study of humor, of what constitutes humor. He'll do like comic books and folk tales and slapstick comedy and movies and whatever, and he'll try to, to his credit, he will try to come up with a set of codes that cover like every given situation of what constitutes comedy. Whether it be he uses like language, allusion when you allude to something, bombast when you're like over the top about something, like that. I'm sure that a lot of people over the years have analyzed that famous comedy shtick by Abbott and Costello concerning the Who's on First skit and all that. I mean, and that's like ripe material for this kind of academic analysis. That whole who's on first, what's on second. Definition, exaggeration, facetiousness. So he feels that he's kind of in these two charts that he has. He said he is of the opinion that, and it's fairly prodigious that he has like found a code for every kind of different kind of humor that he can use to analyze humor. Whether it be in terms of its logic, in terms of its identity, in terms of action, chase, slapstick, speed, but, and then this is the other part of it, parody. What's parody? What's mimicry? But he's just using it as an example of taking a genre and codifying it, finding a code. The codes are like sometimes, and we have to understand that sometimes codes are useful, and then sometimes codes can be rather limiting too. Sometimes we need to break the codes. Sometimes we need to disrupt codes. Sometimes, like for instance, codes of conformity need to be confronted. Codes of same. It's like, for instance, with the pandemic, our codes of our day-to-day lives got disrupted. We had to find different codes for doing things. And now we're like in the situation where we're trying to deal with things psychologically and financially and every other way. And we have to like rewrite the code. We've got to rewrite the code of behavior, right? And with certain buzzwords and certain things that go on, it's like there's like crazy stuff going on out there. There's this whole phenomenon I'm starting to see that I have given the code mask shaming, like on like social media, people doing you know what I mean? Mask shaming, like you gotta wear a mask. I do. I wear a mask. Whatever. But codes. There is a link between. Okay, and let's wrap this up. There is a link between the two, or maybe it is best to suggest that the two are connected, two sides of a coin, because the analysis of expression is also the analysis of thought and thinking. And I need to bring this up just so I can give it some context. I think I kind of went off the rails here. Problems with interview material. One debate is whether interviews are looking for data, information, and facts, or whether they're looking for the way informants speak and organize their information is important. Sometimes it's not the style is more important to your study. That is, should researchers focus on what people are doing and have done, or on the way they express themselves about what they're doing? Which is more important and yields the most interesting information? What informants say or how they say it. There is a link between the two, between what is said and the way that people say it. We know this already from rhetorical analysis and semiotics and discourse analysis and everything else we've done in this course up to this point. There is a link between these two. Or maybe it's best to suggest that the two are connected, two sides of a coin, because the analysis of expression is also the analysis of thought, right? The way we express our thought. Sometimes the way we express our thoughts, the ways that I do a lecture, are as important. The ways that I talk, the ways that I go about things might be as important, I would like to think, as the actual information that I'm giving you. The way that I'm arraying it, the way that sometimes I get emotional about something, or I use anecdotes, or I use examples of stuff to build a kind of conceptual framework for you to ingest, and he quotes from Edward Said. Edward Said is a famous cultural theorist and wrote a book called Orientalism that really kind of started the discourse on third world politics and third worldism and this whole idea of like subaltern groups, and misrepresented and marginalized groups based on culture and ethnicity. And he wrote in his book Orientalism, the real issue is whether indeed there can be a true representation of anything, or whether any and all representation, because they are representations, are embedded first in language and then in the culture, institutions, and political ambiance of the representation. He's asking the question, basically he's not just posing a question. The question is kind of rhetorical. He's asking, when you represent something, it's like, how can representation exist without context? They can't. They really can't. You can't represent something without context. If the latter alternative is the correct one, as I believe it is, then we must be prepared to accept the fact that a representation is eo ipso, as such, by the fact, implicated, embedded, interwoven with great many other things besides the truth, which is itself a representation. So, he's saying, in just egghead language, what he's saying here is basically that it would seem as if everything, truth itself is a representation. It's always based on a context. And I would tend to, I would contest, certain ideas about the idea of like, it's like when somebody says that all truth is relative, it's like, there's arguments against that. There's arguments against that are ontological or philosophical arguments against the nature of relative truth, So, even when the big eggheads like open their mouths, you should always be critical. How much time I got? I got no time. But I wanted to point really quick to his section here just for a minute. Interviews and applications and exercises. These three, and somebody in the class is going to do number one. An alien arrives from Mars in a spaceship, and you got to come up with a list of questions. That should be good if you do it right. All right. The President of the United States grants you it's like these three. Tape a television interview and analyze the questions the interview asked, the questions that should have been asked, and other topics. That's another good one. If you're hard pressed at this point, on a Thursday, of figuring out what you're going to do for next Tuesday, these three are pretty good. All right, these three are pretty good. I've got to shut this down in order to go and do all the nefarious crud I got to do with my day. I hope that everybody's well. This is going to be, I'm going to do like one more video after this. I'm just trying to do due diligence with this on content analysis. I hope all of you are well. We're coming down to the final stretch, folks, and as usual, I have mixed feelings and a little bit of ambivalence and sadness, when things come to an end. But I'll talk about that. Have a good day, guys, and take care of yourselves. Don't let anything get to you too much. Remember, it's like, don't sweat the small stuff, and everything is small stuff. Thank you.